in the private sector, I had the opportunity of opening the Windjammer Landing Hotel in St. Lucia. I've also worked with a gentleman called Mr. Chris Blackwell, who opened up a company called Island Records. And so we had 14 small boutique hotels in Miami, in Jamaica, and in the Bahamas. And I also had the great privilege of working with Mr. Butch Stewart at Air Jamaica. I was the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Sales globally for 8 years with Air Jamaica. And last but not least, I also owned my own hotel, which I started in St. Lucia. So the difficulty with the public sector and the private sector in most countries is they never get together to start in the beginning. And what I mean by that is that when you're running a country, the first thing you must ask yourself, what is the potential of this country? Because if you don't know what the potential is, then how are you going to measure the impact of your collaboration as to whether you're achieving that potential? I always say that when I begin a meeting, what's the finish line? Because I've realized that people interpret words differently. So, as an example, you say that you're in a race, and somebody may think that you're running 100 meters, another person may think you're running 800 meters, another person may think that you're running a marathon. So it means that everybody can run the race and win, but nobody won. So when it comes to the public sector and the private sector, for me it's very important to understand what the roles are for each one in the process. So normally what I say is that you have three core functions. You have a regulatory function, you have a policy function, and you also have an implementation function. So generally speaking, I think there's an acceptance that the public sector is the regulator, the private sector is a better implementer, and then the argument becomes about policy. Some countries believe that the domain of policy is that of the politicians. I believe that policy is a joint function. So businesses respond to their shareholders, whether it's one shareholder, being a small company, or a public company that has a multitude of shareholders. Politicians respond to democracy, which is votes. So if you accept that principle, it tells you why businesses are better at implementing, because there is no democracy in a business. There is a CEO who's been given a very clear mandate as to what he's supposed to achieve. But with politicians, our shareholders are the voters, and therefore we become better regulators in order to ensure that the public good is protected. So it is important that we share a vision. And the vision is, how do we improve and create the best quality of life for our citizens? Now, those are big words. And if you go into a room and ask everybody an opinion as to what they think quality of life means, I guarantee you that you're going to have a multitude of different descriptions. But yet, we argue with each other as if there is only one definition. So, let's take two industries. If we take the energy industry, oil, and we take tourism as an example. With the oil industry, you can bring in an engineer to determine whether in fact you have oil and approximately how much oil you have. Then you can have another company that can tell you how much money it's going to cost to be able to extract the oil. And an economist can tell you what the future price of oil is going to more likely be. So therefore, you're making a decision based on what the potential oil is, how much investment you're going to have to make, and what your rate of return is going to be on that investment. So the potential of the oil industry is the combination of how much oil you have, how much it's going to cost to extract it, how much you can sell it for, and what your profit is going to be. Now, tourism. Nobody measures the potential of tourism. All the tourism numbers we think of is how much tourists did we have last year, and then we think, okay, maybe we can get 5% or 6%. But nobody's ever sat down and said, okay, here is Martinique, here's what's going on in the rest of the world, here's how many hotels we think that we can potentially have, here's what the potential revenue is going to be, how many jobs it can create, and therefore, we're making an investment now to achieve our potential. And what I always say is, when you get in your car, do you drive your car by looking at the rear view mirror? Or do you look forward? So that's potential. If we cannot agree on what our potential is, public sector and private sector, then we have no conversation. So the question becomes, once we establish what that potential is, then it's about what's the best way to maximize that potential. So let me think now of coming from a small country. And relatively speaking, while Martinique is much bigger than St. Lucia, it's still a very, very small country relative to the world. So being efficient is even more important for a small country than it is for a big country. And I met a prime minister, and we were discussing that, and he said to me, so what you're saying, Allan, is that in the absence of economies of scale in a small country, it is important to have economies of speed. The CARICOM countries, 10 of the highest indebted medium-sized countries in the world come from CARICOM. And here is my theory as to why that is the case. Because the World Bank and the IMF are imposing upon us macro policies that are just general macro policies. So to solve the problem, what I say to the bank and to the IMF is you must first start micro. And the reason is because the things that we can do on a competitive basis are limited. Can Martinique produce bananas, pineapples, tomatoes, oranges, apples, coconuts, and do everything? Or because of the economies of scale or the lack of economies of scale, is it better now to focus on some things that we can do extremely well so we can generate the capacity to be able to grow? So you must first understand the capacity within a country, the potential for yield, the potential to be competitive, and once you understand what those industries are or those sectors are, then now you can create policies in order to allow those sectors to grow the fastest. I've never seen it work the other way. Because if you have a business and the policies are not there to support it, and the regulations are not there to support it, and the population doesn't understand what you're doing, you're going to feel like you're swimming upstream every day. So let's take two terms that I've heard here today, and obviously it's a big issue in countries: unemployment and poverty. Unemployment and poverty are the enemy of the politicians and are the enemy of business people. And they're also the enemy of the people who are poor and unemployed. For the business people, it means that opportunities to be able to sell more things are not there. For politicians, it's a cost. You were just hearing about your housing. And for most people who are either unemployed or poor, it's a miserable life. But from an economic perspective, it shows you that you are not fulfilling your potential because you have a resource that is being underutilized. One of the gentlemen brought up a very important issue, the training of that workforce. So if you now know from a country what your focus is, it now has the ability of affecting your education system in order to make sure that the workforce is prepared and able to make the input to allow your businesses to be competitive. So the world's recent solution to that problem is PPPs. So in my country, in order for me to achieve full potential, I have realized that the one capital good I have that I cannot create any more of is land. When I go around and I see an empty piece of land, I ask myself, how many jobs is it creating? How much foreign exchange is it earning? How much taxes is it paying? If you collectively recognize that you're not fulfilling the full potential of your land, then you will never be able to fully occupy your human resources or earn enough taxes to be able to pay for the roads, to improve the school system, in order to be able to put the sporting facilities in to be able to run the hospitals. So, the difficulty with a lot of public sector officials, and this is the most important thing I'm going to say today, is that they believe that they are entitled to money versus going out to earn money. And it's a very, very important concept. Because if you believe that you are entitled to money and you don't have enough money, what you do is you increase the taxes. If you believe that your job is to earn revenue and you're not earning enough revenue, what you do is you try to figure out what's wrong with the process and to fix it in order that you can earn more revenue but at the same tax rate that you currently have. But maybe the existing tax rate you have may also be part of the problem. So the opposition in my country calls me the tropical Trump because they make the comparison that I'm a businessman in politics. But I say to them that the comparison between me and President Trump stops at the fact that we were business people. I had the privilege of being able to work in the public sector. And so therefore, I understand the processes that exist in the public sector and the requirement to be able to change them. So businesses, it's very easy for you to measure your success. You can make money. But making the money, it's not about just making more money than your costs are. It's about making enough money that you can also reinvest and that you're prepared for any catastrophe. Many people don't understand that. But in government, you don't measure the success by revenue. Yes, you can measure it in terms of our fiscal policies and how our budget looks. But more importantly, it's about us delivering a quality of life for our citizens. That is how we measure our success. Do people have access to health care? Do people have access to education? Do people feel safe in their homes? Do people have an opportunity to get a job? That is what we do to measure ourselves. And so the processes that we use in business, those same processes can apply to government. In the case of St. Lucia, we have a GDP of $1 billion. We believe that our potential is closer to $6 billion. But the question is, how do we get there? So I asked myself the question, if we were to double or triple the size of our economies, what would be the problems? So I call them the constraints to growth. So my constraints to growth are, if we grew, my airport can't handle any more traffic. Today, my containers can only come in at nighttime because my ports are full with cruise ships. I don't have enough roads. I can't produce and distribute enough water, and I don't have enough sewage. So those are very clear things that I must be able to achieve, because if you don't have the capacity to be able to grow, then you're not going to be able to grow. The same thing applies to my schooling system. My schools are not generating the students, the workforce that we require for the service sector, whether it be tourism, whether it be financial services, whether it be innovation. We have a problem with our public sector. It takes too long to make applications. Why can't we do it online? I mean, Estonia has become the first paperless government in the world. Why can't we do it? And the last one is, if we grow and we're growing and we're at the same time borrowing money to make that growth happen, more than likely that debt will now prevent us from growing. So every year governments have budgets, and it always amazes me that we all have to sit, particularly from the private sector, and wait for the budget speech to hear what is happening, as if it is some great secret that we're producing a nuclear bomb. So what I've done in my country is we meet with the private sector, we go through all the numbers that we're confronting, these same constraints, we collectively agree on what the priorities are going to be. What's important is what happens afterwards. That once we've agreed that the private sector sees that the government is doing what it said it was going to do. And us as public sector people want to know that once we've done what we're supposed to do, that the private sector are also now making the necessary investments to take advantage of those opportunities. So it's about reducing risk, creating trust, and in creating trust, you create the most important word in any country, confidence. So I want to take this last opportunity to speak very shortly on what I think is the greatest crisis and the greatest threat that we're facing in the Caribbean, which is climate change. So first of all, let me thank your President, Marie-Jean, for his very quick response that he gave to our sister island, Dominica, after Hurricane Maria. In fact, it was the planes from Martinique that first flew over after the hurricane, and it was your president himself who flew in, the first person to fly in to Dominica and to bring satellite phones so that the Dominicans could be in contact with the rest of the world. The climate change issue, for us, it's not about mitigation. It's not about reducing emissions. While living healthier lives and more responsible lives is important, but mitigation for us is not going to help us take control of our future. So this again is an external force that, whether you are St. Lucian, Dominican, Martinican, Guadeloupean, from St. Martin, from anywhere in the world, whether you are rich, poor, illiterate, educated, it does not discriminate. Climate change will affect everyone and everywhere. Martinique does not have the ability of protecting itself by itself. Meaning, in the case of St. Lucia, hurricane didn't hit us, but we have St. Lucians who were living in British Virgin Islands, we have St. Lucians who were living in the US territories, who were remitting monies back to our country. We have fresh produce that we were selling to those countries. We have cruise ships that were coming through Puerto Rico. Like Martinique, we depend on Puerto Rico for a lot of our cruise ships. If Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and St. Martin are damaged, there is going to be no cruise ships. So we must look at this issue on a collective basis. You have the problems with security and crime. St. Lucia is 15 miles away from Martinique. I was saying to somebody today that Venezuela is 6 hours by fast boat. So we must look at our institutions regionally and recognize that we have to work together. We have indicated that France, Holland, the British and the Americans ought to put resources into the regional institutions that we have here to strengthen them. It was amazing to me to watch the Dutch try to help St. Martin from Curaçao, to watch the British try to help BVI and Anguilla from England. It made no sense. So having a proper Coast Guard system, having proper helicopters, having the facilities that we can support each other, it makes all the sense to be able to have one institution that we can share those kinds of things. So this is public sector and private sector at another level. If in fact that we do not invest the money to build the resilience in the countries, let me tell you what will happen. In Dominica, the insurance premium went up 400%.